Another NHL draft in the books, and some obviously Ontario Hockey League prospects moving up into the next level of their hockey career. But before we get into that, if you're just listening and not watching on YouTube, you'll not recognize this face or voice. Dan Mahar, who is a guy that I've actually known most of my life and reminded me, in fact, just before we started this podcast, that I just got back from New York City. And Dan, you reminded me of a trip we took oh so many years ago. And somehow, I mean, I'm going to blame you for it because you're new to this. we got off the train at the wrong spot, ended up taking a really sketchy walk through some really sketchy neighborhoods. And frankly, it's a wonder that we're even here talking right now.
Yeah, well, actually, I blame you for following me. Anyone that follows me through the darkness of night in New York has probably got themselves to blame. But yeah, that was an adventure. Probably not the best decision making, but it's a miracle we're here today.
Well, yeah. Not the best decision making. I recall how that whole trip came together, and it was pretty much a random email saying, "Hey, I'm going to go to New York because I want to see." This was in the Yankees last season at the original Yankee Stadium. And it was like a random Wednesday. We left on the Thursday to catch a game on the Friday or something along those lines, but it was very spur of the moment. And you thought of it, but didn't really press me on it. Like, are we going to get tickets? I'm like, of course we're going to get tickets. It's a random game against Kansas City. And getting the tickets turned out to be an adventure unto itself.
Yeah, I remember it might not be verbatim, but I think your quote was off. I've never paid more than $70 for scalpers tickets. We'll be fine. We'll be fine. So my next memory was scalpers actually laughing at us when we said, $100? Yeah, more like 1,500. Yeah.
But we ended up with great seats to the game at what, $5 or $10 over face value from some kid who had seasons that didn't want them. He brought the train to meet us. Like, it was a pretty wild experience. And then best of all, we saw Alex Rodriguez make a really bad error on a pop fly in foul territory. The Royals, I do believe, won the game. So it was, I mean, as non-Yankees fans, we got to see the beautiful Yankee Stadium, Alex Rodriguez make an error, which is always fun, and the Yankees lose. It was great all around.
Yeah, I don't know that the Alex Rodriguez error was anything uncommon, but my endearing memory of that game was, I believe the Yankees were down 1 run in the 9th, and they got the leadoff runner on first, and put in a young, at that point, Brett Gardner to pinch run, and he got picked off. And that was my first experience with Yankee fan vitriol in person. They let him have it like I've never seen an athlete take it before. And I just said, yeah, we're in New York. This checks out. Yeah.
Everything checked out, and we're still here to reminisce about it today. Okay, so obviously our long history notwithstanding, you're also a longtime Ontario Hockey League season ticket holder. You write at recruits.ca, focusing mostly on Montreal Canadiens prospects. I'm sorry if that team name comes choking out of me, but you do you, pal. You do you. Wanted to bring you on to get some perspective on obviously the draft that happened a week ago. And I think the first thing, I have a thought on it, but let's start with you and Shane Wright, not just falling out of number 1, Dan, but falling to 4th in the draft. I think the Kraken get themselves a bit of a steal here at 4, but what do you think of Wright's precipitous drop in the draft?
Well, I think I was probably as conflicted as everyone on this one. And I actually had the fortune through my contacts with recruits to hear from a few NHL scouts on their take on it, and kind of matched my eye test as well, which was kind of left you wanting more at each and every time. And one of the more critical scouts on the Wright file was really concerned with the effort. Felt there wasn't effort there. There wasn't a compete level. There was not a lot of flash and dash. And he was concerned that Wright might be one of those players that peaked at 15, 16. Class was starting to catch up to him and might not ever realize the potential that was there at 16. So there was those kind of flags were in the scouting community that, having said that, there's a pretty high floor there, I think. I look at guys like maybe a Nugent Hopkins as a comparable, where you have a guy that could play a 2 or 3 C role pretty easily, does decent work in all 3 zones, but might never wow you, might never bring that elite ability to the table. So I think that started to scare people at the top of the draft, because when you're picking top 3, 4, 5, you want to hit on elite. And Wright just didn't show a lot particularly in the playoffs, in the OHL playoffs. Ran into a North Bay team that was good, but certainly is going to face a lot better defenders in his career, and he couldn't muster much against them. And I think that really might have been the final straw.
Okay, you mentioned eye test. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But if indeed, and I've heard similar things, one of the scouts I trust the most over at hockeyprospect.com talked about compete level, and it just wasn't there. I take his word over because I didn't have much in the way of the eye test for obvious reasons. We'll get back to that. But when you talk about him maybe peaking at 15, 16, can we dovetail this into a conversation about the exceptional player status and whether or not it's I'm conflicted. First of all, I don't like exceptional. I think it's a bad label. I think it's bad language. I think we could change it to early entry, for example. But and where I get conflicted though is if somebody is good enough at 15, like you don't want them. I think they're almost wasting a year of development if they're just going to dominate at AAA and put up 160 points. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's probably a little bit of an argument to be made on both sides. If they're truly exceptional, you get a Connor McDavid coming in. John Tavares was similar at that age, and you don't want them dominating 15-year-olds and making a mockery of it and stalling their own development. So you need maybe a recourse for them. I think since some of those cases, it's almost become a little bit of a marketing ploy by some families and some kids at the top. This year, what you see, 3 applications for it. Hard to believe there'd be 3 truly exceptional players in the same draft class. So I just worry a little bit about the optics of it and families. And I think maybe that played in a little to the Shane Wright thing, where people remember that he was exceptional at 15, and that weighs on you as a scout. You're thinking, maybe he is that good. Maybe I should be really strongly considering him. And you're not really seeing the warts and the flaws. So it's a tough file to deal with. But to my mind, I agree with you wholeheartedly. The term exceptional is problematic. Maybe if we just rolled it back a little and said the truly elite players from that class, if they meet certain criteria, yes, they can play in the OHL. But it would have to be truly elite. And I seem to see a lot of fringe cases lately.
So on the eye test piece, thanks COVID, I got to see in his 3 years in the league, should have been 6 viewings. And again, even that, 6 viewings over 3 seasons, forget about. That's why the scouts get paid what they get paid, and that's why they do what they do. But should have been, with the East-West crossover, obviously, 6 viewings. I got to see Shane Wright 3 times. And the only reason I got that 3rd time, so obviously in his rookie year, there's the 2 viewings. Then we have a lost year. And then this most recent season where there was West versus West only and East versus East, there was no crossover. Just so happened, we had a weekend where I worked a Rangers game on the Friday night and there was no other hockey for me that weekend. So went down to Hamilton, and just it turned out Kingston was in town, watched the Bulldogs play the Frontenacs, and saw Shane Wright go 2-2. 2 goals, 2 assists, looked pretty good out there. Again, one random Saturday in November of 2021. So who knows? Again, hearing from scouts that talked about the compete level maybe not being there, I'll take them at their word, but I'm going to say this about that. I'm going to take the entirely lost season and say that was the number one factor in Wright's drop in the draft, right? Because he didn't have anywhere else to play. What could he do? Some kids that were had opportunities in the US, and certainly kids in Europe. Obviously, we saw kids go from here to Europe to play during that lost year. Whether Shane Wright should have looked for that opportunity or whatever, but you take an entire season away from a guy, and that to me is the number one reason he went from a consensus number 1 to a number 4.
Yeah, and that's an extremely valid point. And I completely agree that the lost season is the number one factor. It's not the only factor, but it is the number one factor. I think you're right. You saw it with the OHL in general. Just a couple OHL players picked in the first round, which is rare. There wasn't a ton of elite standout performances in the league this year. But just to play devil's advocate on the other side, harkening back to some of these comments I heard from scouts around the time of the draft and Shane Wright, they did point out that Wyatt Johnson wasn't stung by the lockout or the shutdown. You could cherry pick 4 or 5 other cases of kids that seem to excel. So it's not the only factor, but absolutely it's a top factor. It's a year that Shane Wright probably couldn't afford to lose, and he did.
It's a great point, especially with the Wyatt Johnston comparator. And I still think that the Seattle Kraken at number 4 are getting themselves a highly motivated, highly skilled hockey player moving forward. I don't think we should be signing the death certificate for Shane Wright's career.
No, that's also a very fair point. I actually kind of liked what Seattle did with the draft, and just not to digress too much, but they clearly liked what they saw from the OHL more than some teams. I mean, snagging Ty Nelson in the 3rd round seems like a bit of a steal to me. I know he's not the tallest defender you have, but you've got Ty Nelson and Shane Wright both joining the Kraken franchise, and those were 2 pretty highly touted prospects coming into the OHL. So some potential there for sure.
On the Ty Nelson front, perhaps one of the highlights of the entire season was Ty Nelson mic'd up at the prospects game. We need more of that, please. That was fantastic.
Seems to own a lot of personality, and I think expansion franchise is going to love those 2 for sure. Yeah.
All right. There's another player in particular I want to focus on. He went to Anaheim at number 10. I'll park that for 1 second. But when you look at the draft overall, and you mentioned sort of the scarcity of OHLers in the first round this year, but anything else surprise you, Dan, this time around in the NHL draft?
Well, as it relates to the OHL, I think one thing like contextually to keep in mind that's key to know is that the competition's fierce now. Canadian junior hockey used to be on this pedestal, and it was the prime source of NHL talent. It still is a prime source of NHL talent, but the competition is so widespread now. There's even junior leagues in Germany and Switzerland that are producing players now. So you've got the USHL has really improved, of course, the NCAA in Europe. So I would say it's shocking that we didn't have as much OHL content at the top of the draft. One trend I did know that I think was maybe a little bit surprising was just there were a few players that probably dropped a few shelves from where they probably should have slotted in a normal times. And I wonder if that's tied to some of the general consensus I heard around the scouting community this year that there wasn't that high level of play in the OHL this year that they're accustomed to, and it's probably due to the pandemic and some other reasons. But they were trying to wait. How do you factor that in? It's not the typical OHL we're seeing. There were a few players that went to the AHL that normally wouldn't have gone to the AHL, and there were some of these factors. So, but it seems like a lot of scouts, a lot of NHL teams docked players from the OHL accordingly. So that surprised me a little.
It's such a good point, because we talked about it a lot during the season that just was. And I don't think there's any question that the product we were seeing on the ice night in and night out just didn't match what we were accustomed to. I will say that I was extremely heartened by the conference and then OHL finals, because I felt as though the play had elevated. I think that Flint Windsor series is a great example in the West. It was really high level hockey, and then the OHL final, when you look at the attendance setting record setting attendance in the final game 7, which is a tremendous thing, and then the series itself going 7. It is my hope, because I'm such a passionate fan of this game and this league, that they can use the momentum from what was really almost a classic OHL final to build into next season, because there's no question that the lost season is just what a gut punch really it is for the league. And you talk about the competition now around the world. The Ontario Hockey League had best understand how truly, I don't think devastating is too strong a word, how devastating the impact of that lost season really was, and the work that needs to be done to bring the game back to the level it was before it lost the season.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And I think your observations are bang on. We saw that locally here in Kitchener as a frequent attendee of games here. I think the passion was down a little bit. Some of the enthusiasm, the attendance for sure. I think you made a very good observation with the league finals. And I think the playoffs in some fashion rescued this season for the OHL. It brought some of that back. The attendance came back. The passion came back. Using the Kitchener example, clearly had a relatively successful playoff run this year where they looked like they brought some of the jump back to the building, and there was some positive signs for the future. And you see some of these organizations now starting to say the right things and talk as though they understand that there's some work to do to bring people back from the pandemic. And we see it across a lot of sports and a lot of events where attendance is down, people find other things to do, all these kind of things. So there's work to be done now that some complacency that might have happened pre-pandemic is starting to subside, and we might hopefully return to the product we're used to.
I certainly hope that, because we saw attendance numbers down, of course, around the league, but it's particularly glaring in a market like Kitchener when I think the number was, if it was 4, that's the most that were over 5,000 fans in attendance, and that's just not typical at all. Not to state the obvious. Okay, I want to come back to another player that really I know he was a guy that we were both high on during the season, and Anaheim snags him at number 10. My only question around Pavel Mintyukov, and I mean no disrespect to the Saginaw Spirit as an organization or as a team last season, but I think it's easier. I know it's easier. We all know it's easier to stand out as really great on a team that's not really great. The Saginaw Spirit were not a great team. Mintyukov, when you saw him on the ice, was a force. There's no question. How do you like him going 10 to Anaheim?
I'll be honest, it was a little high for my liking. Terrific player, terrific tools, no doubt about it. He's a first-round talent. No shock at all that he was going. I personally had him going closer to 20. There are a few players I liked a little better in that range, but Anaheim, their scouts, I'm sure know more than I do. Get him out there alongside Drysdale and get a little OHL content. But I think Mintyukov has the sky's the limit, talent-wise, skating-wise, terrific feet, excellent passer and vision, can be a little bit of an adventure in his own end at times. And like you said, to your point, Saginaw was not terribly structured, not terribly functional this year. So it's hard to necessarily evaluate players like that. He probably tried some things that some coaches wouldn't let him try, which helped you stand out to scouts. So there's that positive. But there's obviously work to do there. So I really like his upside, and I think if Anaheim's confident, they can work with that. But I don't see him as an NHL player this year. I'd be surprised. But down the road, for sure, that's an upside pick.
Yeah, and a nice piece to remain, because I agree with you. I don't think there's any danger, if you will, of Mintyukov jumping to the NHL right away. So that's a nice piece for the Saginaw Spirit to continue building around. Obviously, they win that draft lottery, and that's lovely for them. And so we'll see what the league looks like. I'll tell you, I'll just add this in there. Holy moly, with the Western Conference shaping up for 22-23, and the Midwest Division itself. I know Saginaw's in the West Division, but you look at the Midwest Division, and it's going to be like hammer and tong. Erie, I think, is still a half step away, but the other 4 teams in the Midwest, look out for this season. Holy Moses.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I look at it, it's always been scary. Like, I can't remember the last time it wasn't too scary. But wow, is there ever a lot of talent coming back here? And I mean, you look, obviously I have Guelph as probably the powerhouse there with some of the talent they've got. They're returning and bringing in. Owen Sound has a lot of young talent that's about to take a step forward. London's always right in the mix. And then Kitchener, to me, is the complete wild card. If they get some of these kids to report that could report, they're right in the mix. So look out.
So obviously, we try to keep our eyes on the league in general. There are 20 teams, but being based in Kitchener, and obviously as I broadcast for the Rangers, that's the fan base I hear from the most. And one of the first questions I got, Dan, after the first round of the NHL draft was completed was whether or not Montreal's selection of Philippe Mesar is going to in any way advance the possibilities of Mesar showing up in Kitchener, because of course, and again, fans will be what fans will be, but Ben Shoutron, former Ranger, I say in air quotes, because really a former Spitfire, but anyway, whatever, is a scout with Montreal. Is Ben Shoutron somehow going to put an ear into the Montreal Canadiens organization to get Mesar to Kitchener? I say absolutely not, but these are the things that fan bases get excited about. Well,
and don't discount that. I'm not going to put this all on Ben Shoutron, but what I do know is, me putting my plugs in where I can for them. Just I'm obviously a big believer. It's not just a Kitchener thing. I'm a big believer in the OHL and junior as a breeding ground. I think there's nothing about the league that isn't appropriate for a kid that age, especially to develop the pro game on North American ice. What I can tell you about Mesar is, I don't know if you heard, he signed his ELC today, which means Montreal is committed to keeping him in North America this year. So returning to Slovakia or the Finnish league, which were possibilities, not options. He's going to be Montreal, Laval, or Kitchener. And I know GM Kent Hughes was a little non-committal when asked directly about it. Having said that, I would have to handicap the odds at about 75% of him actually showing up here. I know the kid himself, is quite open to Kitchener. He's flat out said he's willing to report to Kitchener and thinks it would be a good step. It's now in the hands of the Habs, and don't discount it. I think there's a pretty good chance.
Yeah, I don't dispute that at all. And I also don't want to diminish Ben Choutron's role. Great guy, great former Ranger. Ran into him for the first time in forever because he's based out west, but at a game in Erie this season. Had a nice little chat and catch up. And there's a little note in the calendar somewhere to get him on this podcast at some time in the not too distant future and catch up with them. Okay, before we wrap this up, let's just, because you got me thinking about it when you mentioned the worldwide field, really, arena for players and the competition and being so fierce, and maybe the OHL isn't quite on, or the CHL really on that pedestal it was historically. You look at the NHL draft, 25%, give or take, is the number of OHLers that have gone in the first round historically, so it's a pretty good number. Overall, about 20% of players that have come through the Ontario Hockey League have been drafted somewhere into the NHL. Doesn't mean they played, but they were drafted. They earned that next step, so it still speaks to its development possibilities. But when you talk about the worldwide arena for players and competition, I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to our buddy with the London Free Press, Ryan Payette, beating that drum over and over again. The London Knights have the most prospects in the world. He was very clear in pointing out, drafted into the National Hockey League at 191 prospects through the Knights organization into an NHL fold. I believe the numbers go from there: Peterborough, Oshawa, Kitchener in terms of top four. I've got to do a lot of a deep dive into figuring out all of those numbers and machinations there. But Payette says number one organization in the world for developing NHL talent is his favorite team, the London Knights. You're welcome, Payette.
Well, I know Ryan as well. I'm gonna first take a little bit of a gentle shot before.
Don't be gentle. Don't be gentle.
No, I was just gonna say, like, the London Knights were accustomed to powerhouse year after year, steep upward trend through the season. This year, I actually thought something changed a little bit in London. I didn't see that steep upward curve from the Knights that you're usually seeing. I know they had some injury issues and whatnot. Having said that, just to bring it back to the draft too, I will throw Payette this bone and say I thought Isaiah George probably was a bit of a steal in the fourth round, and that is one player in the London Knights that looked impressive to me and has potential. Certainly where he was drafted. So we'll give Ryan that one.
You know what? And it's a good point, because he was, Isaiah George, not a fun player to play against at all. And yeah, fourth round seems to be, I certainly would have thought in the first three rounds myself. So
yeah, for sure. That's where I had him for sure. But yeah.
We know too that along with Ryan Payette's coverage, the London Knights and the way they do business is really, I'm just going to say this, it's really good for the Ontario Hockey League, because I am positive, Dan, and I think you get the same sense, that they relish the role that they have as being the team that 19 other fan bases detest. It's perfect. It's everything this league needs. And if we just tie it back into the point about momentum from the playoffs and the conference final and the OHL finals, that this league needs to carry, they need a nice, healthy, antagonistic bunch in the Forest City in 22-23 to keep this fan base energized.
Absolutely. I mean, you and I both took our share of English over our careers and stories, and every good story needs a villain. And London is perfectly, organizations have to strive to compete with. And that's only, like you said, it's only a good thing. It drives it. They recruit players to the league, which makes the league better. They force other teams to recruit. It's only a good thing.
I think this was a pretty good thing. We should do it again. Dan, promise me that you'll come back and do at least one more of these with me, and we'll see what happens.
All right, I'll try not to say too many more nice things about the London Knights, just to keep my job security here. So
perfect. We just want to keep Ryan Payette happy enough that he doesn't make it too difficult when we have to visit Budweiser Gardens. It's that simple.
Fair enough, because you know he will.
Dan, thanks for doing this. It's been fun.
Thanks, Parwell. Good talking.